Picture this. You're sitting in your boss's office, staring at a termination letter that was never signed, while he demands you apologize to his incompetent son for doing your job too well. That was my Tuesday morning at Hartwell Manufacturing, and by Friday afternoon I was walking out the door with contact information for 7 of their biggest clients tucked safely in my briefcase. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting ahead. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights in the Hartwell Manufacturing building had this annoying flicker that made everything look slightly off-kilter, like you were viewing the world through a broken television screen. I'd grown accustomed to that flicker over my 3 years working there as senior account manager, but on that particular morning in October, it seemed more pronounced than usual. Maybe it was because I knew something was about to go very wrong. I arrived at the office at 7:30 sharp, just like every other weekday for the past 36 months. The parking lot was nearly empty except for my Honda Accord and the janitor's beat-up pickup truck. I preferred getting in early. It gave me time to review my client files, prepare for the day's calls, and most importantly, avoid the morning rush of incompetence that typically flooded the sales floor around 9 o'clock. Hartwell Manufacturing specialized in custom metal fabrication for the aerospace industry. We weren't the biggest player in the market, but we'd carved out a solid niche by delivering quality work on tight deadlines. At least, that's what we used to do before nepotism started eating the company from the inside out, like rust on cheap steel. My desk sat in the corner of the sales department, positioned strategically so I could see both the main entrance and the conference room where most of our important meetings took place. Over the years, I'd turned that little corner into my command center. Charts tracking client satisfaction scores lined one wall, while another displayed a color-coded calendar showing delivery schedules for our top 20 accounts. Everything was organized, efficient, and most importantly, profitable. The phone started ringing at 8:15. Marcus Chen from Aerospace Dynamics wanted to discuss expanding their monthly order from $50,000 to $75,000 worth of precision bracket. I'd been nurturing this relationship for 18 months, slowly building trust through consistent delivery and proactive communication. Marcus wasn't the type to throw money around carelessly. Every dollar had to be justified to his board of directors. "Sarah, I've got good news," Marcus said, his voice crackling slightly through the speakerphone. "The board approved the expansion. We're looking at a long-term contract, potentially 3 years if everything goes smoothly. A $75,000 monthly contract with a 3-year guarantee. That was over $2 million in guaranteed revenue, not including the inevitable add-ons and rush orders that always came with aerospace clients. I could practically feel the commission check burning a hole in my future bank account." "That's fantastic news, Marcus. I'll draw up the preliminary agreements and have them to you by Thursday. Do you want to schedule a site visit so your engineering team can review our new CNC capability?" We spent another 20 minutes discussing technical specifications and delivery schedules. Marcus was particular about quality control procedures, which made sense given that his brackets would eventually find their way into commercial aircraft. One defective part could ground an entire fleet, so I made sure to document every requirement with obsessive detail. By 9:30, the sales floor had filled with the usual suspects. Janet Morrison sat at the desk closest to the break room, loudly discussing her weekend bowling league performance with anyone within earshot. Tom Rodriguez was already on his 3rd cup of coffee, frantically trying to catch up on the client calls he should have made the previous week. And then there was Bradley Hartwell III, the owner's son, stumbling in 45 minutes late with his hair still wet from what was obviously a very recent shower. Bradley was 28 years old and possessed all the business acumen of a soggy sandwich. He'd graduated from some expensive East Coast college with a degree in communications, which apparently qualified him to handle major client relationships despite having never successfully closed a deal worth more than $10,000. His father, Bradley Hartwell Jr., had appointed him as assistant sales director 6 months earlier, a title that came with a corner office and a salary that probably exceeded mine by 30%. The younger Hartwell made his way across the sales floor like he was walking through quicksand, stopping every few steps to lean against a desk or filing cabinet. His bloodshot eyes and the faint smell of bourbon that followed him suggested he'd had another one of his legendary Monday night adventures at whatever trendy bar was currently hosting his presence. "Morning, team," he mumbled, his voice thick with either exhaustion or leftover alcohol. "Big day ahead of us. Big day." Nobody responded. We'd all learned months ago that engaging with Bradley during his frequent hangover episodes was like trying to have a meaningful conversation with a broken radio. Lots of static and very little actual communication. I turned my attention back to my computer screen, where I was reviewing the quarterly performance metrics. The numbers told a clear story. While the overall sales department was down 8% from the previous year, my personal accounts had grown by 23%. 7 of my 10 clients had increased their monthly orders, and I'd successfully landed 3 new accounts through referrals and cold outreach. The aerospace dynamics deal would push my quarterly numbers even higher. Combined with the recent expansion of my contract with Precision Parts International and the new agreement with Midwest Aviation Supply, I was looking at a record-breaking quarter. The commission structure at Hartwell was generous, 15% on everything over quota, which meant I was potentially looking at a 5-figure bonus check. Around 10:30 my phone rang again. This time it was Rebecca Walsh from Titan Aerospace, one of the industry's biggest players. Rebecca was calling about a rush order for specialized mounting hardware needed for a military contract. The timeline was aggressive. They needed everything manufactured and delivered within 3 weeks, but the order value was substantial enough to justify overtime production. "Sarah, I know this is short notice, but we're in a bind," Rebecca explained. "Our primary supplier just informed us they can't meet the deadline due to equipment failure. I need someone who can guarantee delivery by November 15th. 3 weeks to manufacture and deliver a $40,000 order of complex mounting hardware. Most suppliers would laugh at that timeline, but I knew our production capabilities better than anyone. If we could get the raw materials by Thursday and run the CNC machines on double shifts, it was achievable. Let me check with production and get back to you within 2 hours, I told Rebecca. If we can make it work, I'll need 50% down to secure the materials and expedite the tooling. This was exactly the type of challenge I thrived on. While other account managers focused on easy, low-value orders, I'd built my reputation by taking on the difficult projects that required coordination between multiple departments. It meant longer hours and more stress, but it also meant bigger commissions and stronger client relationships. I spent the next hour on the phone with production manager Dave Kowalski, reviewing machine schedules and material availability. Dave was a straight shooter who'd been with the company for 15 years. He knew exactly what our capabilities were and wasn't afraid to say no when a deadline was unrealistic. "It's going to be tight, Sarah, but we can make it happen," Dave finally concluded. "I'll need to bring in a weekend crew and probably run the night shift on overtime, but the hardware isn't overly complex. Standard aluminum stock with basic threading and finishing work." By noon I had confirmation from purchasing that the raw materials could be delivered by Thursday morning, and Dave had restructured the production schedule to accommodate the rush order. I called Rebecca back with a firm commitment and emailed her the signed quote within minutes of hanging up. That was when Bradley Hartwell III decided to insert himself into the situation. I was just finishing up the paperwork for the Titan Aerospace order when Bradley appeared at my desk, swaying slightly and gripping a cup of coffee like it was his lifeline to consciousness. His tie was crooked, his shirt had what appeared to be mustard stains near the collar, and his expensive leather shoes were somehow covered in what looked like parking lot gravel. "Hey Sarah," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Heard you were working on something big with Titan. Thought I should probably take point on that one, given my position and all." I looked up from my computer screen trying to process what I'd just heard. Bradley wanted to take over the Titan Aerospace account, the same Bradley who'd never successfully managed a rush order in his entire career. The same Bradley who once forgot to place a material order and cost the company a $15,000 contract. "Actually, Bradley, I've already got everything handled," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "The quote is signed, production is scheduled, and materials are being delivered Thursday. The client specifically requested to work with me on this project." Bradley's bloodshot eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning slowly in his alcohol-soaked brain. Right, but see, that's not really how things work around here anymore. Major accounts need to go through proper channels. Corporate oversight, there were no proper channels for rush orders. There was no corporate oversight policy. There was just Bradley feeling threatened by someone else's success and trying to claim credit for work he had nothing to do with. I understand your concern, I said, but this order is time-sensitive and already in motion. Changing account managers at this point would create confusion and potentially jeopardize the delivery date. Bradley leaned against my desk, knocking over my coffee mug in the process. The lukewarm liquid spread across my quarterly reports, soaking through the papers I'd spent an hour preparing for the afternoon meeting. Oops, he said, making no effort to help clean up the mess. Look, Sarah, I'm trying to be nice about this, but you need to understand something. My father owns this company, and I'm the assistant sales director. That means major accounts go through me. It's not personal, it's just a business hierarchy. I grabbed a handful of napkins from my desk drawer and started mopping up the spilled coffee, trying to salvage what I could of my ruined reports. Bradley, the client, has already signed the quote with my name on it. Changing account managers now would require new paperwork, new approvals, and potentially delay the entire order. Is that really what you want? What I want, Bradley said, his voice getting louder, is for people around here to remember who's in charge. You might be good at your job, Sarah, but you're not irreplaceable. None of us are. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The sales floor had gone quiet. Everyone was pretending to work while obviously listening to our conversation. Janet had stopped discussing her bowling league. Tom was staring at his computer screen without moving his mouse. Even the phone calls had stopped. I finished cleaning up the coffee and looked directly at Bradley. The Titan account stays with me. I've already committed to the client, and I'm not going to risk a $40,000 order because of ego management. That's when Bradley's face turned red, not the gentle pink of embarrassment, but the deep crimson of someone whose authority had been challenged in front of his subordinates. He straightened up, trying to project confidence despite the fact that he was obviously struggling to stand upright. "We'll see about that," he said, pointing an unsteady finger at my face. "We'll just see about that." He stumbled away from my desk, leaving behind the faint scent of bourbon and the unmistakable tension that comes from a workplace confrontation. I knew this wasn't over. In fact, I was pretty sure things were about to get much worse. The rest of Tuesday passed in an uncomfortable silence that felt like the calm before a tornado. Bradley spent most of the afternoon locked in his corner office, occasionally emerging to have hushed conversations with his father's secretary, Mrs. Patterson. She was a stern woman in her 60s who'd been with the company since before Bradley was born, and wielded more actual power than most people realized. Whenever she walked across the sales floor, conversation stopped, and people suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. I focused on my work, finalizing the production timeline for the Titan Aerospace order, and following up with 3 other clients about their pending quotes. Around 4 o'clock I received an email from Marcus Chen, confirming the 3-year contract details for Aerospace Dynamics. The legal department would need 2 weeks to review the terms, but everything looked solid. Between the Titan Rush order and the Aerospace Dynamics expansion, I was looking at roughly $200,000 in new business for the quarter. Jennifer Liu from our accounting department stopped by my desk around 4:30 with a stack of commission calculations. Jennifer was one of the few people at Hartwell who genuinely understood the sales process and how it connected to the company's bottom line. She'd been tracking my performance metrics for the past year, and often provided insights that helped me identify opportunities for account growth. "These numbers look incredible, Sarah," she said, keeping her voice low. "If the Aerospace Dynamics contract goes through as planned, you're looking at commission payments that'll put you in the top 5% of industrial sales reps nationwide." Jennifer's calculations showed that my year-end commission would exceed my base salary by almost 40%. More importantly, the client retention rate for my accounts was 96%, compared to the department average of 73%. Those weren't just good numbers, They were exceptional numbers that demonstrated measurable value to the company. "I've been doing this for 12 years, Jennifer continued, and I've never seen anyone build client relationships the way you do. Most sales reps focus on closing deals, but you focus on solving problems. That's why your clients keep coming back and referring to new business." We discussed the commission structure and payment schedule for another few minutes before Jennifer headed back to her office. As she walked away, I noticed Bradley standing in his doorway, watching our conversation with obvious interest. He'd changed clothes at some point during the afternoon. Gone were the wrinkled shirt and stained tie, replaced by a fresh button-down and what appeared to be a newly knotted necktie. His hair was combed, his shoes were clean, and the smell of bourbon had been replaced by an overpowering cloud of expensive cologne. The transformation was striking, but not in a good way. Clean Bradley was somehow more unsettling than hungover Bradley. At least when he was disheveled and obviously impaired, you knew what you were dealing with. This version of Bradley looked like he was preparing for something important, and given our earlier confrontation, I doubted it was anything that would benefit me. Wednesday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and the promise of what should have been a routine day. I'd scheduled a conference call with the Midwest Aviation Supply Team to discuss their upcoming project requirements, followed by a site visit from the quality control manager at Precision Parts International. Both were established clients with straightforward needs, the kind of accounts that generated steady revenue without requiring constant hand-holding. The Midwest Aviation call went smoothly. They needed standard mounting brackets for a new aircraft maintenance facility, nothing complex or time-sensitive. We discussed specifications, delivery schedules and pricing for about 30 minutes before agreeing on a preliminary quote that I'd formalize by Friday. The order value was modest, around $12,000, but Midwest had a history of expanding their initial orders once they saw the quality of our work. The quality control visit was equally routine. Helen Rodriguez from Precision Parts wanted to review our inspection procedures for the titanium components we manufactured for their aerospace clients. Helen was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about our measurement equipment and documentation process. After 2 hours of walking through our quality control protocols, she signed off on our certification renewal, which meant another year of guaranteed business with one of our most reliable clients. It was during lunch that the first warning sign appeared. I was eating a sandwich at my desk while reviewing the afternoon's call schedule, when Mrs. Patterson approached with a manila folder tucked under her arm. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone carrying important information, and her expression suggested that whatever was in that folder wasn't good news. "Sarah, Hartwell would like to see you in his office at 2 o'clock, she announced, her voice carrying the formal tone she reserved for official business. "Please bring your current client files and any pending contract documentation." That was unusual. Bradley typically communicated through email or brief phone calls. Face-to-face meetings in his office were reserved for significant issues, either very good news or very bad news. Given the events of the previous day, I suspected this fell into the latter category. "Is there anything specific he'd like me to prepare?" I asked, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. Mrs. Patterson's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Just bring your files, dear. Everything will be explained during the meeting." The 2 hours between lunch and the scheduled meeting crawled by with agonizing slowness. I organized my client files, printed copies of recent contracts, and reviewed my performance metrics for the quarter. If this was about my work quality, I had documentation to support every decision I'd made. If it was about something else entirely, I wanted to be prepared for any scenario. At exactly 2 o'clock, I knocked on the door to Bradley Hartwell Sr.'s office. The room was a monument to corporate success, with mahogany furniture, expensive artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the parking lot and the industrial complex beyond. Bradley sat behind a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly despite his growing paunch. But it was the other person in the room who immediately caught my attention. Bradley sat in one of the leather chairs facing his father's desk, looking remarkably different from the disheveled mess I'd encountered the previous day. His hair was perfectly styled, his clothes were immaculate, and his posture suggested someone who was completely sober and fully alert. The transformation was so complete that I almost didn't recognize him. "Sarah, please sit down," Bradley Sr. said, gesturing toward the empty chair next to his son. "I understand there was some kind of incident yesterday regarding the Titan Aerospace account." I sat down carefully, placing my folder of client files on my lap. There was a disagreement about account management responsibilities, but the situation was resolved professionally. "The Titan order is proceeding as scheduled." Bradley Jr. leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and concerned. "Dad, I think there might be some confusion about what actually happened. I was trying to provide guidance on proper procedure, and Sarah became quite hostile about it." The word hostile hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I'd been firm and professional during our conversation, but nothing about my behavior could reasonably be described as hostile. This was clearly a calculated misrepresentation of the facts, and I could see where this conversation was heading. "I wasn't hostile," I replied, keeping my voice level. I explained that the client had already signed the quote and that changing account managers would create unnecessary complications. Bradley disagreed with my assessment. Bradley Sr. opened a leather portfolio and consulted what appeared to be handwritten notes. "According to Bradley, you were dismissive of his authority and refused to follow proper chain of command protocols. Is that accurate?" The question was phrased in a way that made any answer sound like an admission of guilt. If I said yes, I was admitting to insubordination. If I said no, I was contradicting Bradley's version of events and potentially calling him a liar. Either way, I was being maneuvered into a defensive position. I followed the same procedures I've used for every major client over the past 3 years. The Titan account specifically requested to work with me based on our previous successful projects. Changing account managers midstream would have jeopardized a $40,000 order. Bradley Jr. shook his head with what appeared to be genuine disappointment. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about, Dad. She's not willing to acknowledge that there might be better ways to handle these situations. It's always about what Sarah thinks is best, never about what's best for the company." The accusation was so far removed from reality that I almost laughed. My client retention rate was the highest in the department. My accounts generated more revenue per dollar invested than any other sales rep in the company. I'd brought in over $500,000 in new business over the past 18 months. How could any of that be construed as not acting in the company's best interests? Bradley Sr. closed his portfolio and looked directly at me. "Sarah, you've been with us for 3 years, and your performance has generally been satisfactory. However, we can't have situations where senior staff members feel their authority is being undermined. It creates a hostile work environment and affects team morale." Satisfactory. 3 years of record-breaking performance, and he was calling it satisfactory. I doubled my territory's revenue, maintained the highest client satisfaction scores in the company, and personally generated more profit than any other account manager in Hartwell's history. But according to Bradley Sr., all of that amounted to generally satisfactory performance. "I understand the importance of maintaining professional relationships," I said, "but I also have a responsibility to my client. When someone specifically requests to work with me on a time-sensitive project, I need to honor that commitment." Bradley Jr. leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "The problem is that you don't seem to understand your place in the company hierarchy. I'm the assistant sales director, which means major accounts should be coordinated through me. It's not personal, it's just how successful companies operate." That was the moment I realized this entire meeting was orchestrated. Bradley Jr. had spent the previous day planning this confrontation, probably with his father's guidance. The cleaned-up appearance, the prepared talking points, the coordinated narrative, none of this was spontaneous. They'd decided to put me in my place, and they were using the Titan account as their justification. Bradley Sr. picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk and slid it across the mahogany surface toward me. "We've prepared a formal reprimand that will be placed in your personnel file. It outlines the proper procedures for handling major accounts and emphasizes the importance of following chain of command protocols." I picked up the paper and read through it quickly. The document was filled with corporate buzzwords and vague references to insubordination and failure to follow established procedure. What it didn't contain was any specific mention of what I'd actually done wrong, beyond refusing to hand over a client account to someone who was demonstrably less qualified to manage it. This reprimand doesn't accurately reflect what happened, I said. I followed the same procedures I've used for every major client. Nothing I did violated company policy or put any account at risk. Bradley Jr. stood up and walked over to the window, his hands clasped behind his back like some kind of military officer reviewing truth. The issue isn't what you did, Sarah. The issue is your attitude about it. You seem to think that because you're good at your job, you don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. The irony was breathtaking. Bradley Jr., who'd never successfully managed a major account in his entire career, was lecturing me about following rules while simultaneously trying to claim credit for work he had nothing to do with. Meanwhile, his father sat behind his expensive desk, nodding along as if this made perfect sense. I've never claimed to be above company rules, I replied. I've simply tried to do what's best for our clients and our bottom line. Every decision I've made has been focused on maintaining the relationships that generate revenue for this company. Bradley tapped his pen against his desk blotter, creating a rhythmic clicking sound that filled the silence. Sarah, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your technical skills are solid, but your interpersonal skills need improvement. Specifically, you need to learn how to work collaboratively with senior staff members, even when you disagree with their approach. Collaboratively, as if collaboration meant automatically deferring to someone whose primary qualification was having the right last name. As if 3 years of successful client relationships meant nothing compared to 6 months of nepotistic appointment to a made-up position. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Bradley Sr. explaining the importance of team dynamics and Bradley Jr. offering examples of how I could better integrate with the department's management structure. Every word felt like sandpaper against my professional dignity. They were treating me like a problem employee who needed correction, when in reality I was the most successful account manager in the company's history. Finally, Bradley Sr. pushed a pen across his desk toward me. We need you to sign the reprimand, so we can move forward constructively. This is a learning opportunity, not a punishment. I stared at the pen for a long moment, understanding that this was a crossroads. Signing the reprimand would mean accepting their version of events, and acknowledging that I'd somehow been wrong to prioritize my clients over Bradley Jr.'s ego. Refusing to sign would escalate the situation into something much more serious. I need some time to review this document thoroughly, I said, standing up from my chair. Can I provide my response tomorrow morning? Bradley nodded, but his expression suggested that delay was merely postponing the inevitable. Of course, take all the time you need, but remember, Sarah, we're all on the same team here. Sometimes being a team player means accepting guidance from people with more experience in leadership roles. I walked out of that office, knowing that my time at Hartwell Manufacturing was coming to an end. The only question was whether I'd leave on my terms or theirs. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at the formal reprimand document spread across my kitchen table like evidence in a criminal case. The words seemed to mock me with their corporate doublespeak and carefully crafted ambiguity. Failure to demonstrate collaborative leadership, and resistance to established management protocols, were fancy ways of saying I'd refuse to let an incompetent nepotist hire steal credit for my work. My cat Winston jumped onto the table and began sniffing the papers with the disdain that only cats can properly express. Even he seemed to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. I scratched behind his ears while mentally reviewing my options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. Option 1, sign the reprimand, accept the narrative that I was somehow in the wrong, and continue working under increasingly hostile conditions while Bradley Jr. systematically undermined my client relationships. This would preserve my immediate income but essentially guarantee that my career at Hartwell would stagnate or worse. Option 2, refuse to sign and face whatever escalation the Hartwells had planned, which would likely result in termination for insubordination. This would maintain my professional integrity, but leave me unemployed in a specialized industry where reputation mattered more than anything else. Option 3, take control of the situation before they could implement whatever scheme they were cooking up. I spent 2 hours researching employment law and reviewing my contract with Hartwell. The good news was that my employment agreement contained a standard non-compete clause that prohibited me from working for direct competitors within a 50-mile radius for 18 months. The bad news was that the clause said nothing about starting my own company or taking clients who specifically chose to follow me to a new firm. More importantly, I'd been meticulous about documenting my client relationship. Every phone call, every email, every meeting had been logged in my personal CRM system. I had detailed records showing that my clients worked with me personally, not with Hartwell Manufacturing as an abstract corporate entity. In several cases, the clients had specifically stated that they chose Hartwell because of their confidence in my ability to manage their accounts. Around 10 o'clock, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began drafting a resignation letter. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove to the office for what I suspected might be my final day at Hartwell. The parking lot was busier than usual, with several cars I didn't recognize occupying visitor spaces near the main entrance. Through the lobby windows, I could see people in expensive suits carrying briefcases and portfolios, either potential clients or consultants brought in for some kind of corporate initiative. The sales floor buzzed with unusual energy. Janet Morrison was actually at her desk before 9 o'clock, frantically organizing files and cleaning her workspace. Tom Rodriguez had traded his typical casual attire for a pressed shirt and tie. Even the administrative staff seemed more alert and professional than normal. Miss Patterson interceded before I could reach my desk, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. She carried a thick manila envelope and moved with the purposeful stride of someone delivering important news. "Sarah, Miss Hartwell would like to see you immediately," she announced loud enough for half the sales floor to hear. "Please bring your building access card and any company property you might have in your possession." The request for my access card sent a chill down my spine. That wasn't standard procedure for a routine meeting, that was termination protocol. They were planning to fire me, probably for refusing to sign the reprimand document I hadn't even had a chance to respond to yet. I gathered my personal items quickly, stuffing family photos and my favorite coffee mug into a cardboard box while trying to appear casual. Several coworkers watched with obvious curiosity, but nobody asked questions. Everyone understood that being summoned to the owner's office with instructions to bring your access card meant only one thing. The walk to Bradley Sr.'s office felt like a death march. Each step echoed against the polished floors, and I could feel eyes following my progress across the building. By the time I knocked on his door, my heart was pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Come in," Bradley Sr. called from behind his massive desk. The office setup was different from our previous meeting. Bradley Jr. sat in his usual chair, but now there was a third person present, a woman in her 40s wearing a tailored business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed corporate attorney. She introduced herself as Linda Brennan from the law firm that handled Hartwell's employment issues. This was serious. They'd brought in legal counsel for a termination meeting, which suggested they were either expecting resistance or preparing for potential litigation. Either way, they were treating me like a threat rather than a valued employee with a track record of success. Bradley Sr. gestured toward the empty chair, his expression carefully neutral. "Sarah, we've reviewed the situation from yesterday's meeting, and we've made some decisions about how to move forward." Linda Brennan opened her portfolio and consulted a typed document. "Ms. Mitchell, we understand that you've had some time to consider the reprimand document presented to you yesterday. Have you reached a decision about signing it?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my own envelope, the resignation letter I'd drafted the previous evening. "Actually, I have something I'd like to share first." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Bradley Jr. sat up straighter in his chair, while his father's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Linda Brennan set down her document and focused her full attention on me, clearly recognizing that the script for this meeting had just been rewritten. "I'm submitting my resignation from Hartwell Manufacturing, effective 2 weeks from today," I announced, placing the envelope on Bradley Sr.'s desk. "I believe this is in everyone's best interest." Bradley Sr. opened the envelope and read through my letter quickly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The letter was professional and diplomatic, expressing gratitude for the opportunities I'd been given while citing philosophical differences regarding client management approaches as my reason for leaving. "This is unexpected," he said finally. "We were prepared to offer you an opportunity to continue with the company under modified terms." Linda Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Miss Mitchell, before we discuss your resignation, I think it's important that you understand the full scope of your contractual obligation. Specifically, the non-compete clause in your employment agreement contains some very specific restrictions on future employment opportunities." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They were reminding me that leaving Hartwell would severely limit my options in the local aerospace manufacturing industry. The non-compete clause would prevent me from working for any of their competitors within a 50-mile radius for 18 months. Effectively blacklisting me from the only industry I'd ever worked in. "I'm familiar with the non-compete clause," I replied. "I've reviewed it thoroughly with my attorney." This was a small lie. I hadn't actually consulted an attorney yet, but I needed to project confidence and preparation. Bradley Jr. finally spoke up, his voice carrying a smugness that hadn't been there during our previous interaction. "Sarah, I think you're making a mistake. The employment market for account managers is pretty competitive right now. Finding another position with comparable compensation could take months, especially with the restrictions in your contract." He was probably right about the job market, but he was making a critical assumption that I planned to work for someone else. My resignation letter hadn't mentioned my future plans because I hadn't finalized them yet. But sitting in that office, listening to veiled threats about my career prospects, I realized that my path forward was becoming clearer. Bradley Sr. set my resignation letter aside and opened another folder. "Sarah, let me be direct with you. Your performance over the past 3 years has been solid, and we'd prefer not to lose that institutional knowledge. However, we need to know that our management decisions will be respected and implemented without resistance." In other words, Linda Brennan added, "We're prepared to accept your resignation, but we'd also be willing to discuss terms for you to remain with the company if you're open to acknowledging some mistakes and committing to a more collaborative approach going forward." They were offering me a deal: stay with the company, sign the reprimand, publicly acknowledge that I'd been wrong to resist Bradley Jr.'s authority, and continue working under conditions that would essentially make me a second-class employee in my own territory. The alternative was unemployment with a non-compete clause hanging over my head like a sword. What exactly would more collaborative approach entail? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Bradley Jr. smiled. And it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Well, for starters, all major account decisions would need to be approved through my office. I'd also want to be included in client meetings and contract negotiations, so I can ensure we're presenting a unified company message." Unified company message. He wanted to insert himself into relationships I'd spent years building, claiming credit for successes he'd had nothing to do with while positioning himself as the real decision-maker in my accounts. It was a transparent power grab, disguised as corporate policy. "And if a client specifically requests to work only with me," I asked, "then we explain that Hartwell Manufacturing is a team-based organization." Bradley Sr. answered, "Our clients work with the company, not with individual employees. If they can't accept that arrangement, then perhaps they're not the right fit for our corporate culture." The audacity was breathtaking. They were prepared to risk losing major accounts rather than acknowledge that some clients preferred working with me directly. Their egos were more important than the company's revenue, which explained a lot about the challenges Hartwell had been facing in recent years. Linda Brennan consulted her notes again. "Mitchell, I should also mention that your resignation would trigger immediate termination of all company benefits, including your health insurance and retirement contributions. Given the current job market conditions and your contractual restrictions, you might want to consider whether immediate resignation is really in your best financial interests." Another threat, this one more direct. They were essentially saying that leaving the company would result in financial hardship that could last for months or even years. The message was clear: comply with our demands, or face economic consequences that could devastate your personal finances. I looked around the room at these 3 people who were trying to manipulate me into accepting a subordinate role in my own career. Bradley Sr., who'd built his company through hard work but was now willing to sacrifice it to advance his incompetent son's career. Bradley Jr., who'd never earned anything in his life but felt entitled to claim credit for other people's achievements. And Linda Brennan, who was being paid to make legal threats sound like friendly advice. I appreciate the offer to reconsider, I said, standing up from my chair. But I'm confident that resigning is the right decision for everyone involved. I'll spend the next 2 weeks transitioning my accounts and ensuring that all client needs are met during the changeover. Bradley Jr.'s smile disappeared. Sarah, I don't think you understand what you're giving up here. Do you have any idea how difficult it's going to be to find comparable employment with your contractual restrictions? You're basically unemployable in this industry for the next 18 months. That assumes I plan to work for someone else, I replied. There are other options available. The room went quiet. Linda Brennan looked up from her notes with obvious interest, while both Hartwells stared at me with expressions that suggested they were trying to process what I'd just implied. Bradley Sr. leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Sarah, I hope you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting, because if you're planning to start a competing business using knowledge and relationships you developed while employed by this company, that would create some very serious legal complications. I'm not suggesting anything, I'm simply pointing out that the employment market offers various opportunities for someone with my experience and track record. But even as I spoke, I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. They were realizing that my resignation might not be the simple personnel change they'd anticipated. If I left and took even a few clients with me, it could create a significant financial impact on the company. And if those clients followed me because of personal relationships rather than corporate loyalty, there might not be much Hartwell could do to prevent it. The meeting ended with strained politeness and vague promises to work together during my transition period. But as I walked back to my desk, I could feel the weight of their stares following me across the building. They'd underestimated me, assuming that financial pressure and legal threats would force me to capitulate to their demand. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent the past 3 years building something much more valuable than a job. I'd built a reputation, a network of professional relationships, and a track record of success that transcended any single company. And over the next 2 weeks, I was going to find out just how much those intangible assets were actually worth. The news of my resignation spread through the office like wildfire, though the official story was carefully sanitized. According to the company line, I was pursuing new opportunities and leaving on excellent terms. But the whispered conversations in the break room and the meaningful glances exchanged during meetings told a different story. Everyone knew something significant had happened behind closed doors. Jennifer Liu from accounting was the first to approach me directly about the situation. She waited until Friday afternoon when most of the sales staff had left early for weekend plans, then quietly made her way to my desk with a concerned expression. Sarah, is everything okay? She asked, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. I heard about your resignation, and honestly, it doesn't make sense. Your commission projections for next quarter were off the charts. I appreciated Jennifer's directness. Unlike most of my coworkers, she understood the financial mechanics behind sales performance and recognized that successful people don't typically quit during their best earning periods without compelling reason. Let's just say there were some philosophical differences about account management that couldn't be resolved. I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Sometimes it's better to leave on your own terms rather than wait for circumstances to deteriorate further. Jennifer nodded slowly, clearly reading between the lines. If you don't mind me asking, what are your plans? Because honestly, losing someone with your client relationships is going to create some serious revenue gaps that I'm not sure anyone else here can fill. That was exactly the opening I'd been hoping for. Jennifer's comment confirmed what I'd suspected. My departure would create measurable financial damage that couldn't be easily replaced by internal personnel. More importantly, she was thinking about the situation from a business perspective, rather than a political one. I'm still evaluating my options, I said, but I'm curious about something. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to start their own consulting firm in this industry, what would be the biggest challenges from a financial planning standpoint? Jennifer's eyes widened slightly as she processed the implications of my question. Hypothetically, the biggest challenge would be cash flow during the startup phase. Most clients pay on 30 to 60-day terms, so you'd need enough capital to cover operating expenses for at least 3 months before seeing significant revenue. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing the theoretical logistics of starting an independent consulting business. Jennifer explained how client billing cycles worked, what kinds of insurance and bonding requirements were typical in the aerospace industry, and how to structure contracts to protect both the consultant and the client. Her insights were invaluable, and more importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in helping me understand the practical aspects of entrepreneurship. "Sarah, can I give you some unofficial advice?" Jennifer asked as our conversation wound down. "If you're seriously considering going independent, you should talk to Marcus Chen at Aerospace Dynamics. He mentioned during their last audit that he was frustrated with how difficult it was to get consistent service from most suppliers. He specifically said he wished there were more people like you in the industry." Marcus Chen, my biggest client with a 3-year contract worth over $2 million in potential revenue. If Marcus was already dissatisfied with typical supplier relationships and appreciated working with me personally, he might be receptive to continuing that relationship regardless of which company I represented. Monday morning brought an unexpected development. Bradley Jr. appeared at my desk at 8:30 sharp, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing what appeared to be a genuine smile. The transformation was startling. Gone was the smugness and entitlement from our previous interactions, replaced by something that looked almost like friendliness. "Morning, Sarah," he said, settling into the guest chair beside my desk. "I wanted to touch base about the transition process. Dad and I have been talking, and we really want to make sure this goes smoothly for everyone involved." I looked up from my computer screen, trying to read his intentions. This was the same person who'd demanded control of my accounts just days earlier, and now he was acting like we were old colleagues working together on a mutual project. "I appreciate that, Bradley. I've been preparing detailed handover documents for each of my accounts, including contact histories, project timelines, and relationship notes. Everything should be ready for review by Wednesday." Bradley nodded enthusiastically, as if this was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. "That's fantastic. Actually, I was thinking it might be helpful if I could sit in on some of your client calls this week. Just to observe how you handle things so I can maintain the same level of service after you're gone." The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but I could see the underlying strategy. Bradley wanted to insert himself into my client relationships during the transition, positioning himself as my successor and attempting to transfer loyalty from me to him personally. It was a clever approach that might actually work with clients who valued consistency over individual relationships. "That could be arranged for some calls," I replied carefully. "Though I should mention that several clients have specifically requested individual transition meetings to discuss their accounts. They want to understand how the changeover will affect their projects and timeline." This was partly true. Marcus Chen had indeed requested a private meeting, but I was also testing Bradley's reaction to the idea that some clients might be more attached to working with me than he anticipated. Bradley's smile faltered slightly. "Individual meetings, is that really necessary? I mean, we're all part of the same company, right? The service level should be exactly the same regardless of who's managing the account." "In theory, yes," I agreed, "but these are relationships I've been building for years. Some clients just prefer to discuss changes face-to-face rather than hearing about them through email or phone call." What I didn't mention was that I'd already scheduled private meetings with Marcus Chen, Rebecca Walsh from Titan Aerospace, Helen Rodriguez from Precision Parts International, and 4 other major clients. These weren't transition meetings. They were exploratory conversations about the possibility of continuing our working relationship through a different arrangement. The rest of Monday passed quietly, with me focusing on documentation while keeping my ears open for office gossip. By lunchtime, I'd learned that Bradley Jr. had spent the morning in his father's office with Mrs. Patterson and someone from the HR department. They were clearly planning something, though the details remained unclear. Tuesday brought the first client meeting. Marcus Chen arrived at 11 o'clock for what was officially described as a transition briefing, but quickly evolved into something much more significant. We met in the smaller conference room rather than Bradley Sr.'s imposing office, creating a more intimate atmosphere for what I knew would be a delicate conversation. "Sarah, I have to be honest with you. Marcus began after we'd covered the basic project update. When I heard about your resignation, my first instinct was to start looking for alternative suppliers, not because I don't trust Hartwell as a company, but because I trust you as an individual. This was exactly the opening I'd hoped for, but I needed to be careful about how I respond. Any suggestion that I was actively recruiting clients away from Hartwell could create serious legal problems if the conversation was later reported to management. I appreciate that confidence, Marcus. I've enjoyed working with Aerospace Dynamics, and I'm committed to ensuring a smooth transition regardless of what happens next. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. What I'm really asking is whether there's any possibility of continuing to work with you directly, even if you're not with Hartwell anymore, because frankly the aerospace industry is full of companies that can manufacture brackets and mounting hardware. What's rare is finding someone who understands the technical requirements, delivers on schedule, and communicates proactively when problems arise. The compliment was flattering, but more importantly, it confirmed that Marcus valued our working relationship above his loyalty to Hartwell as an institution. This was exactly the type of client feedback that could support an independent consulting arrangement. That's an interesting question, I replied. Hypothetically, if someone were to start their own consulting firm specializing in aerospace component sourcing and project management, would that be something Aerospace Dynamics might consider working with? Marcus didn't hesitate. Absolutely. In fact, that might be preferable to working with a larger company where I'm just one account among many. With an independent consultant, I'd know that my projects were getting personal attention rather than being handed off to whoever was available that week. We spent another 30 minutes discussing the theoretical logistics of such an arrangement. Marcus explained that Aerospace Dynamics worked with dozens of independent consultants and suppliers, and that their procurement policies actually favored smaller firms that could provide specialized expertise. More importantly, he mentioned that their current 3-year contract with Hartwell contained a clause allowing them to designate preferred project managers for specific initiatives. Sarah, let me ask you directly, Marcus said as our meeting concluded. If you were to start your own firm, when would you be available to take on new projects? Hypothetically, I'd need about 3 weeks to handle the legal paperwork and establish the necessary business infrastructure, but the timing would depend on a lot of factors that I'm still evaluating. Marcus stood up and shook my hand, but held onto it longer than necessary. Well, if you do decide to go that route, I hope you'll consider Aerospace Dynamics as your first potential client. We've got a new project starting in December that would be perfect for someone with your background. After Marcus left, I sat in the empty conference room, reviewing what had just happened. One of my biggest clients had essentially offered to follow me to a new company, and he'd hinted at additional projects that could provide immediate revenue for an independent consulting firm. The conversation had exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Wednesday brought meetings with Rebecca Walsh from Titan Aerospace and Helen Rodriguez from Precision Parts International. Both conversations followed similar patterns: initial concern about the transition, followed by expressions of confidence in my abilities, and finally tentative inquiries about the possibility of continuing our working relationship through alternative arrangements. Rebecca was particularly direct about her concerns. Sarah, I've worked with a lot of suppliers over the years, and most of them treat rush orders like inconveniences rather than opportunity. You're one of the few people who actually seems to enjoy solving complex logistics problems under tight deadlines. Helen's feedback was equally encouraging. Honestly, the reason Precision Parts has been so satisfied with Hartwell is because we've been working with you personally. I'm not sure how confident I am about continuing that relationship if you're not going to be involved in our projects. By Wednesday afternoon, I had preliminary commitments from 3 major clients representing approximately $400,000 in annual revenue. More importantly, each client had indicated that they would be willing to work with an independent consultant rather than exclusively with large manufacturing firms. Thursday morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Bradley Jr. appeared at my desk carrying a stack of papers and wearing an expression that suggested he was about to deliver unpleasant news. Sarah, we need to talk, he announced, loud enough for several nearby coworkers to hear. There are some concerns about the transition process that need to be addressed immediately. I saved the document I was working on and turned to face him. What kind of concerns? Bradley set the papers on my desk with unnecessary force. Well, for starters, we've received some feedback from clients that suggests you might be discussing future business arrangements that go beyond standard transition protocols. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire alarm. Someone had reported my client conversations to management, either directly or indirectly. The question was whether this was based on actual information, or just suspicion about my meetings with key accounts. I've had several transition meetings with clients to discuss their ongoing projects, I replied carefully. That's standard procedure for account managers who are leaving the company. Bradley leaned against my desk, his proximity clearly intended to intimidate. Right, but there's a difference between transition meetings and recruitment meetings. We need to make sure we're all clear about the distinction. The threat was obvious but indirect. He was accusing me of recruiting clients without actually saying so, probably because he didn't have concrete evidence to support the allegation. But the warning was clear: they were watching my activities closely, and would take action if they suspected any impropriety. I understand the distinction, I said. All of my client interactions have been focused on ensuring continuity of service during the changeover period. Bradley straightened up and gathered his papers. Good, because we've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow morning to review the transition status with Dad and our legal counsel. We want to make sure everything is being handled appropriately. Another meeting with Linda Brennan, the corporate attorney. This was escalating beyond simple personnel management into something that could have serious legal implications. They were building a case for some kind of action, though I wasn't sure yet what they were planning. That evening, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to a business attorney who specialized in employment law and corporate formation. The second was to a commercial insurance broker who could help me understand the bonding and liability requirements for independent consulting firms. Both conversations were enlightening and encouraging. The attorney confirmed that my non-compete clause was fairly standard but contained several loopholes that could be exploited legally. The insurance broker explained that establishing proper coverage for a consulting firm was straightforward and relatively inexpensive. More importantly, both professionals emphasized that clients had the right to choose their service providers, and that no company could prevent customers from taking their business elsewhere based on personal preferences for specific individuals. Friday morning's meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, giving me just enough time to finalize the preparations I'd been working on all week. I arrived at the office early and printed several copies of a document I'd spent considerable time crafting, a detailed analysis of my client relationships and their potential impact on Hartwell's future revenue. When I walked into Bradley Sir's office at exactly 9 o'clock, I was carrying more than just transition paperwork. I was carrying the foundation for a new chapter in my career, one that would be built on the relationships and reputation I'd earned through 3 years of exceptional performance. The meeting was about to begin, but the real negotiation had been happening all week, and I was finally ready to reveal just how much leverage I actually possessed. The conference room felt different this time. Gone was the mahogany elegance of Bradley Sir's office, replaced by the sterile corporate atmosphere of the main meeting space. Fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the polished table, and the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air like a reminder of all the failed negotiations that had taken place within these walls. Bradley sat at the head of the table, flanked by Linda Brennan and a man I didn't recognize, another attorney based on his expensive suit and the thick portfolio he carried. Bradley Jr. occupied the chair across from me, his expression a mixture of smugness and anticipation that suggested he believed this meeting would end with my complete capitulation. Mrs. Patterson entered carrying a recording device which she placed in the center of the table with ceremonial precision. The message was clear: everything said in this room would be documented and potentially used against me in future legal proceedings. Sarah, Bradley began, his voice carrying the weight of corporate authority. We've asked you here this morning because some concerning information has come to our attention regarding your transition activities. Linda Brennan opened her portfolio and consulted a typed document. Specifically, we have reason to believe that you've been using company time and resources to solicit clients for potential future business arrangements that would compete directly with Hartwell Manufacturing. The accusation was serious and specific, which meant they had more than just suspicions. Someone had provided them with detailed information about my client meetings, or they'd been monitoring my communications more closely than I'd realized. I've conducted transition meetings with several key clients to ensure continuity of service, I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. Those meetings were necessary to protect Hartwell's ongoing relationships and revenue streams. The unknown attorney leaned forward, his pale blue eyes focusing on me with laser intensity. Miss Mitchell, I'm Robert Daniels from Morrison & Associates. We specialize in employment law and contractual disputes. I've reviewed your employment agreement and the specific language regarding post-employment restrictions. He slid a document across the table toward me. This is a detailed analysis of your contractual obligations, including the non-compete clause that prohibits you from engaging in competitive activities within a 50-mile radius for 18 months following termination of employment. I picked up the document and scanned through it quickly. The analysis was thorough and intimidating, highlighting every restriction and potential penalty with legal precision. They were trying to demonstrate that any attempt to start my own business or work with former clients would result in immediate litigation. I'm familiar with my contractual obligations, I said, setting the document aside. I have no intention of violating any agreements I've made with this company. Bradley Jr. couldn't contain himself any longer, because Marcus Chen from Aerospace Dynamics called yesterday to discuss alternative arrangements for his upcoming projects. He specifically mentioned that he'd rather work with you directly than continue with Hartwell. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Marcus had contacted Hartwell directly, either not understanding the delicate nature of our conversation or deliberately forcing the issue into the open. Either way, my carefully planned transition strategy had just been exposed. Marcus Chen is a valued client who has concerns about maintaining service quality during the transition. I replied, trying to buy time while I processed this development. It's natural for clients to have questions when their primary contact is leaving the company. Linda Brennan consulted her notes again. Miss Mitchell, we also received similar inquiries from Rebecca Walsh at Titan Aerospace and Helen Rodriguez at Precision Parts International. Both specifically asked about the possibility of continuing to work with you through alternative business arrangements. 3 clients had contacted Hartwell directly. That wasn't a coincidence, it was a coordinated action that suggested they'd discussed the situation among themselves and decided to make their preferences known to company management. This was either the best possible outcome or the worst possible disaster, depending on how I handled the next few minutes. Bradley Sr. leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Sarah, what we're dealing with here isn't just a resignation. It's a systematic attempt to steal our client base using relationships you developed while employed by this company. That constitutes a clear violation of your fiduciary duties and potentially actionable interference with existing contracts. Robert Daniels opened his portfolio and produced another document. We're prepared to take immediate legal action to protect Hartwell's business interests. This includes seeking emergency injunctive relief to prevent you from contacting any former clients and pursuing damages for lost revenue resulting from your unauthorized solicitation activities. The legal threat was comprehensive and terrifying. They were talking about court orders that would prevent me from working in my chosen field, combined with financial damages that could bankrupt me even if I eventually won the case. The cost of defending against such litigation would be enormous regardless of the ultimate outcome. But I'd spent the past week preparing for exactly this scenario. Reaching into my briefcase, I pulled out my own document, the analysis I'd prepared, showing the relationship between my personal performance and Hartwell's revenue stream. Before we discuss legal action, I said, I think everyone should understand the full scope of what's at stake here. I slid copies of my analysis across the table to each person present. The document was 23 pages of detailed financial data, client feedback and performance metrics that painted a clear picture of my value to the company. Over the past 3 years, my accounts have generated approximately $1.8 million in revenue for Hartwell Manufacturing. I began, watching their faces as they absorbed the numbers. My client retention rate is 96%, compared to the department average of 73%. 7 of my 10 major clients have specifically stated that they chose Hartwell because of their confidence in working with me personally. Bradley Jr. looked up from the document with obvious skepticism. Those are impressive numbers, Sarah, but they don't change the fact that you've been soliciting our clients for your own business. Actually, Bradley, I haven't solicited anyone, I replied. Every conversation I've had with clients has been initiated by them expressing concerns about maintaining service quality after my departure. I've simply listened to their concerns and answered their questions honestly. Linda Brennan frowned as she reviewed my analysis. Mitchell, even if we accept that characterization, the practical effect is the same. You've created a situation where major clients are threatening to leave unless they can continue working with you personally. That's correct, I agreed. And that brings us to the real issue here. Hartwell Manufacturing has a choice to make about how to handle this situation. I reached back into my briefcase and produced one final document, a proposal I'd spent 2 days crafting with input from my attorney and business consultant. Option 1, I continued, is to pursue litigation against me for violating my employment agreement. If you choose that path, I'll be forced to defend myself aggressively, which means subpoenaing client communications and deposing key accounts about their decision-making processes. During that litigation, which could last months or years, I estimate that Hartwell will lose approximately 60% of the revenue from my former accounts. The room went silent as they processed the implication. Pursuing legal action against me would require them to involve our clients in the litigation process, potentially damaging those relationships irreparably regardless of who ultimately won the case. Option 2, I said, sliding the proposal across the table, is to recognize that this situation represents an opportunity rather than a threat. Bradley Sr. picked up my proposal and began reading, his eyebrows rising with each page. You're suggesting that we establish a formal consulting arrangement. Exactly. I'm proposing to form an independent consulting firm that would specialize in aerospace account management and technical liaison services. Hartwell Manufacturing would be my primary client, and I would continue managing the relationships I've developed while also pursuing new business opportunities that could benefit both companies. The proposal was comprehensive and professionally structured. Instead of losing my accounts to a competitor, Hartwell would maintain access to my client relationships while reducing their overhead costs for account management. I would handle client communications, project coordination, and new business development on a contract basis, with revenue-sharing arrangements that would benefit both parties. Robert Daniels looked up from the proposal with obvious surprise. This is essentially a partnership arrangement rather than traditional employment. That's correct, I confirmed. It would allow Hartwell to maintain relationships with key clients while giving me the independence to develop my career without violating any contractual restrictions. Most importantly, it would demonstrate to our clients that both parties are committed to maintaining the highest levels of service during the transition. Bradley Jr. was shaking his head before I finished speaking. This is ridiculous. You're basically holding our clients hostage to force us into some kind of partnership deal. It's extortion. It's business reality, I replied. These clients have made their preferences clear. You can either work with that reality constructively, or you can fight it destructively, but you can't change it. Linda Brennan was studying my proposal with the careful attention of someone evaluating a complex legal document. Ms. Mitchell, this arrangement would essentially make you an independent contractor rather than an employee. That would eliminate most of the restrictive clauses in your current employment agreement. Exactly. And it would allow Hartwell to maintain revenue streams that would otherwise be lost while establishing a framework for future growth that benefits everyone involved. Bradley set down my proposal and looked directly at me. Sarah, I have to admit that this is not what I expected when we scheduled this meeting. Give us a moment to discuss this privately. The 3 attorneys and Bradley Jr. left the conference room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the recording device that continued running silently in the center of the table. Through the glass walls I could see them engaged in animated discussion in the hallway, with lots of gesturing and document reviewing. 20 minutes later they returned to the conference room with expressions that suggested they'd reached some kind of decision. Bradley Sr. resumed his seat at the head of the table while the attorneys arranged their papers with renewed purpose. Sarah, Bradley Sr. began, we've reviewed your proposal, and while it's creative, we have some concerns about the precedent it would set. If we allow departing employees to dictate the terms of their separation based on client relationships, it could create problems with other staff members in the future. Linda Brennan nodded in agreement. There's also the question of whether such an arrangement would actually solve the underlying problem. If clients are truly loyal to you personally rather than to Hartwell as a company, then any consulting arrangement would be temporary at best. I could see where this was heading. They were going to reject my proposal and pursue the litigation strategy, gambling that they could intimidate me into compliance while maintaining their client relationships through sheer institutional momentum. I understand your concerns, I said, but I think you're underestimating the financial implications of the alternative approach. I reached into my briefcase one final time and produced a folder containing signed letters from 7 clients. Before making your final decision, you should probably review these. Bradley Sr. opened the folder and began reading the first letter, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The letter was from Marcus Chen at Aerospace Dynamics, formally notifying Hartwell that they would be terminating their contract within 30 days, unless I remained as their primary account manager in some capacity. Jesus Christ, Bradley Jr. muttered as he read over his father's shoulder. They're all termination notices. 7 clients, representing over $800,000 in annual revenue, had formally notified Hartwell that they would be ending their business relationships unless I continued managing their account. The letters were professional and diplomatic, citing concerns about service continuity and project management expertise, but the message was unmistakable. Robert Daniels read through the letters with the expression of someone watching a carefully constructed legal strategy collapse in real time. These clients have coordinated their response. This level of organization suggests they've been planning this action for some time. Actually, I said, they planned this action over the past 48 hours. After news of your investigation into my transition activities became public knowledge, these clients decided to make their preferences known directly rather than allowing speculation to continue. The room fell silent again as the full scope of the situation became clear. My clients hadn't just expressed preferences for working with me. They'd issued ultimatums that would force Hartwell to choose between accepting my consulting proposal or losing nearly $1 million in annual revenue. Bradley Sr. closed the folder and looked at me with something that might have been respect. You orchestrated this entire situation, didn't you? The resignation, the client meetings, even this proposal. It was all part of a coordinated strategy to force us into a partnership arrangement. I protected my professional interests while ensuring the best possible outcome for my clients, I replied. Everything I've done has been legal, ethical, and focused on maintaining the business relationships that generate revenue for this company. Linda Brennan consulted her notes one final time. Miss Mitchell, assuming we were to consider your consulting proposal, what would be your timeline for implementation? I could have the necessary business infrastructure established within 2 weeks. My attorney has already prepared the corporate documents, and my insurance broker has confirmed coverage availability. The only remaining step would be finalizing the specific terms of our consulting agreement. Bradley Jr. was staring at the termination letters with obvious disbelief. This is insane. We're essentially being forced to negotiate with someone who's holding our clients hostage. We're being offered an opportunity to maintain profitable business relationships while reducing overhead costs. I corrected. The alternative is to lose those relationships entirely while spending enormous amounts of money on litigation that might not succeed. Bradley Sr. stood up from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot where this entire situation had begun just days earlier. When he turned back to face the table, his expression suggested he'd reached a decision. Sarah, we'll need 72 hours to review your proposal with our legal team and board of directors. In the meantime, we'll ask our clients to postpone any contract terminations while we work out the details of a potential consulting arrangement. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was acceptance of the fundamental reality I'd created. Hartwell Manufacturing would work with me as an independent consultant rather than risk losing nearly $1 million in annual revenue to protect Bradley Jr.'s. 3 months later, I was sitting in my own office, a modern space in a business park 15 minutes from Hartwell's facility, reviewing quarterly performance reports for Mitchell Aerospace Consulting. 7 major clients had followed me to the new firm, just as I'd predicted, but more importantly, The consulting arrangement with Hartwell had generated enough additional business to double my previous income while providing them with cost savings that improved their overall profitability. Bradley Jr. had left the company 6 weeks after our final meeting, accepting a position with his uncle's real estate firm in another state. According to office gossip, his departure was described as pursuing opportunities more aligned with his skill set. The revenge hadn't been getting even, it had been getting ahead. Sometimes the best way to deal with workplace bullying isn't to fight back directly, but to demonstrate so much value that fighting you becomes more expensive than accommodating you. And sometimes, when your boss makes you apologize for outshining his incompetent son, the appropriate response isn't an apology, it's a business plan. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.